has been successful, and I have invited the choir to join us in the Christmas Carol concert in December. We move to topical questions. Question number 1, Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when the Glasgow Airport Strategic Transport Network study will be published.
Minister Keith Brown.
We expect the report, which was commissioned by Glasgow Airport Limited, to be available after the 12th of March this year.
Mark Griffin.
It's been reported, it's been a number of months since a number of press outlets reported on the initial proposals from this study, and we still await that outcome despite the Minister selectively briefing the press last week. Can the Minister confirm if any of the options in the Glasgow Airport Strategic Transport Network study will require the purchase of any land to allow that option to go ahead?
Minister.
Well, first of all, there was no selective briefing. There was a statement that was issued, which in part responded, of course, to calls from the Labour Party to have sight of this as soon as possible. It's worth bearing in mind that the consistent accusations that we have delayed this report just don't seem to take account of the fact, of course, the report was led by Glasgow Airport and not by the Scottish Government. In relation to the proposals which are offered, obviously the question of the improvements to bus services wouldn't require any land take. It is perfectly possible that the option of a tram-train link would require land, although it seems to be, from the initial report, not likely to be the land associated with the previous Garrel project, but that may require land. But that's exactly why I've asked officials to look into this further and come back with more detail on that proposal.
Mark Griffin.
I think the Minister makes the point for me that he's not sure which land is needed, if any, and where that location. It seems bizarre that when a report which was part funded by the Scottish Government, at the same time that the Scottish Government decided to sell off land at a massive loss to the public purse of over £8 million, which could then be needed to implement some of the report's recommendations. Why was that sale carried out when, as the Minister himself has stated, the requirement for any future land was uncertain?
Minister.
Well, we made clear during the course of the report that we did not intend to support a heavy rail option. We made that clear to all the partners. We would not be funding any heavy rail option. Now, obviously, it was an option for different partners if they wanted to bring forward one that they wanted to fund or that the private sector could fund. But we made that clear. So that's why we proceeded with the disposal of land. And in that process, of course, I've saved £179 million, which would have been the cost of Garrel. And it's quite right that we asked the different partners, and in particular the consultants, to look at what other possibilities there are. And he says I should really know which land is being proposed to be taken for that link. Well, that's exactly the point of this study, to come up with what proposals would be possible to take forward. And now we're saying to them, well, let's look at that in more detail. This is exactly what Glasgow Airport, who led the study, asked of the consultants. We've been supportive of that, supportive of Glasgow Airport, just as they've been supportive of our subsequent statements. And, of course, working together with the consultants, we can come forward with a conclusion as to how viable a tram-train link would be. Of course, there are issues with that. This is not to say that we would support that. But let's look at the possibilities there and go ahead with what the one thing the Labour Party seems to have forgotten about is what will benefit the people wanting to get to and from Glasgow Airport. James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. What I find extraordinary about this situation is that while we had one section of Transport Scotland selling off the land around Glasgow Airport relating to an airport rail link, another section is involved in discussions with a group that's considering rail links. You know, really, I think the question has to be asked, is the Minister in control of his department, or has power been passed over to the Sir Humphrey Appleby unit at Transport Scotland?
Minister.
I think we've heard all this before from James Kelly. I'm not sure whether he sees this as extraordinary or astonishing, whichever range of adjectives he wants to use. But to be honest, we are moving forward from the position that James Kelly refers to. And what's been done quite openly by the Scottish Government is say, let's listen to what the partners involved in this, Renfrewshire Council, Glasgow City Council, and most importantly the airport, what they believe. And let's take an objective way forward, which is by using consultants, which everyone has agreed upon, a report which is led by the airport and which genuinely seeks to find out what is the best way And if you look at the recommendations of the report when it's published, and it's available on request from Glasgow Airport, who commissioned it, you will see that the cost-benefit ratio, for example, for a tram train link, notwithstanding the fact there is still a lot of detail to be gone into, is substantially better than it would have been, something like 3 times the benefit-cost ratio of a heavy rail link. So let's open our minds to the possibilities which are here, rather than living in the past, making accusations which are clearly nonsensical and not well-based. And let's try and genuinely look at what benefits people in relation to getting to and from Glasgow Airport, and modal shift away from the private car and from taxis wherever it's possible. Let's try and go ahead together on that and see what we can achieve.
Question number 2, Cameron Buchanan.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it has had any further discussion with COSLA on the local government finance settlement for 2015-2016.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, I meet the COSLA leadership on a regular basis and we discuss a range of matters. I wrote to all COSLA leaders on the 21st of February, setting out that I was minded to approve the proposals from the Convention, not to update the relevant indicators, but considered that in the interest of transparency, Council leaders should be aware of the implications of such a course of action. I received the COSLA President's reply yesterday, in which he informed me that COSLA leaders have agreed collectively to reconsider their position at their meeting on the 25th of April, once they have had the opportunity to scrutinise the detailed calculations behind the 2 sets of figures. My officials are working with COSLA to provide all the relevant information required to enable that consideration to take place.
Cameron Buchanan.
I thank the Maestro for his reply. He is no doubt aware of the fact that Glasgow City Council is widely expected to quit COSLA later this week. Should that happen, fully a quarter of Scotland's population will potentially be represented by a local authority which is no longer affiliated to the organisation next year, as they have to give a year's notice. On that basis, does he believe that the COSLA continue to be legitimately negotiate on behalf of councils?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, membership of COSLA is a matter for individual councils to resolve. The Scottish Government, for its part, remains committed to working in partnership with local government. As I understand it, under the rules of COSLA, a local authority must give at least 1 year's notice that it intends to leave the organisation. And membership is for each financial year, so the earliest that a council's departure can take effect is the 1st of April 2015. But I stress, Presiding Officer, that these are matters for individual councils, and the Government's interest is in ensuring that we maintain a strong partnership relationship working with local government in Scotland.
Mr. Buchanan.
Thank you. Thank you. Friday's votes at COSLA, where I understand its position was reaffirmed at the time, it seems a pretty sort of farcical situation. We have a Labour councils being whipped to vote for a settlement which will see many lose money. But at the same time, the single biggest benefactor, which is Glasgow City Council, is preparing to leave. Truly a sort of a triumph of Politburo politics. Surely COSLA is losing its credibility, never mind its members. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what contingency plans are in place for negotiating future financial settlements with local authorities should COSLA fail? And could we have a detailed formal statement from the Minister in the near future?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would stress to Mr Buchanan that I do consider these matters to be issues for individual local authorities to consider, and for them to consider them collectively with other local authorities within the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. It is not for me to write the rules of COSLA or to be involved in the internal processes of that organisation. What I am absolutely crystal clear about is the Scottish Government, since 2007, has attached the strongest importance to working in partnership with local government in Scotland, and we intend to continue to do so.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that by failing to vote for an update to the distribution formula, Aberdeen City Council's Labour leaders will cost the City an extra £7.5 million? And that instead of trying to pick nonsensical fights with Scottish Government ministers, whether they be slips of the tongue or not, they should get on with getting the best deal for Aberdonians to improve the delivery of frontline services for Aberdeen citizens.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Mr Stewart is absolutely correct that the difference between the flat cash proposition that was supported by COSLA leaders several months ago and the application of the needs-based formula is a difference of about £7.5 million for the City of Aberdeen Council. It is obviously up to that council to determine how it exercises its responsibilities in relation to these questions, but I would point out that Aberdeen City Council is not backwards at setting out to me its demands for increased money. So to turn its back on resources is a rather strange conclusion to arrive at. Mr Stewart makes reference to the news which has been percolating around in the course of the last 24 hours that somehow the City Council intended to exercise some ban on ministers. I understand that has now been described from what's been shared to me as I came into the chamber today as a slip of the tongue. Whatever that means, whatever that means, I don't think it's a particularly mature and sensible way to go about exercising the business of a local authority, and the Government intends to continue, as it continues to do with all local authorities in Scotland, to continue with open and forthcoming dialogue, as I will be having later on today with certain local authorities in Scotland, to pursue the issues that matter to the people of our country.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that detailed reply? Does he accept that at the heart of the challenge that COSLA and its members face is the underfunding of our council services through cuts to the resources budget, the underfunding of the council tax freeze, and their view that if councils had received the same percentage of the budget in this year as in 2010-11, there would be an extra £600 million for that budget allocation? And does he think it acceptable to pit council against council rather than address the yawning gap between the costs of council services and the underfunding of the settlement proposed by the Cabinet Secretary this year?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, in the interests of cross-party understanding, I would be grateful if Sarah Boyack would write to me to explain the £600 million calculation that she's just lodged in the parliamentary record, because I am unable to work out how on earth that point can in any way be valid. The local authority's share of the budget in 2010-11 was 31.3%. On a like-for-like basis, that is now 32.2%. So I am afraid I cannot, for the life of me, understand how that proposition is valid. So if Sarah Boyack would do me the courtesy of explaining that to me, I would be very interested to understand that basis. Now, to give Sarah Boyack some other statistics, between 2007-8 and 2012-13, the Government's budget increased by the resources under the control of the Scottish Government increased by 6.4%. Over the same period, local government's budget increased by 8.9%. I simply ask Sarah Boyack and her colleagues, who voted, by the way, for my budget in 2014-15, exactly what the big claim was for local government, because it was not a proposition they advanced to me during the budget negotiations for 2014-15, or for
Ms Boyack.
Or for that matter, Presiding Officer, on any other occasion in which I have been the Finance Minister, has the Labour Party ever come to me in this parliamentary process and asked me to give more money to local government. So if Sarah Boyack would do me the courtesy of sending me an explanation of that £600 million figure, I would be very grateful.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officers. Cameron Buchanan made clear it may well be that Orkney Islands Council is part of a dwindling band of councils who are not threatening to leave COSLA at this stage. But as the Finance Secretary will be aware, there has been long-standing dissatisfaction with the way the funding formula funds Orkney compared to the other island groups. I recognise the challenges in addressing this, but perhaps he could update the Chamber on ways in which, perhaps working alongside his colleague, the Transport Minister, ways can be found to inject funding into the likes of our internal ferry services that addresses that underfunding in comparison to Shetland and the Western Isles. Cabinet Secretary.
I'm obviously very familiar with the issues that Mr MacArthur raises. They have been advanced to the Government by Orkney Islands Council in the comparative assessment between Shetland and the Western Isles. The funding formula takes into account, as Mr MacArthur knows, a variety of different indicators that assess issues around population, about rurality, about island status, a whole variety of different indicators and produces the outcome with which we are all familiar. Obviously, there is always space to consider the composition of those indicators, and we will, of course, respond constructively to any suggestions that are made to us in that respect. On the point in relation to the internal ferry services of the Orkney Islands, I am familiar with these issues again, and we've taken various steps over the term of this administration to help in resolving some of those genuine challenges that face the Council, and I know that the Transport Minister will continue that dialogue with Orkney Islands Council.
Linda Fabiani.
Presiding Officer. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary is aware that the Labour Tory coalition in South Lanarkshire Council is also considering leaving COSLA. But this is despite the fact that the COSLA position agreed by the Cabinet Secretary would allocate £3 million more than the one should it be a needs-based indicator. So would the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that in some cases this discussion is about politicking on behalf of some councils rather than the needs and well-being of their areas?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think, Presiding Officer, the issues that have always been made clear to me by local government in Scotland over my term in office as Finance Minister has been of the necessity of ensuring that the relevant indicators of the various assessment points of need were updated on an annual basis to ensure that we, as closely as possible, reflected the needs of individuals within the resources that are available through local government funding. A different position was taken to that by the leaders of local government this year, and I felt in the interests of ensuring that there was clear transparency around the decision-making here, because I clearly was going to undertake this assessment. Parliament would be very surprised if I didn't undertake this assessment, and the information could have been made public at any occasion. I decided to make that available to inform the deliberations of local government, and I await local government's determination on the issues that I've raised as part of this process.
Alex Rowley.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Would the Cabinet Secretary confirm that amongst the winners and the losers of the distribution formula that Fife Council will be a loser, but more importantly, will he confirm that regardless of the formula, at the end of the day, local councils across Scotland are facing very difficult times and will have to cut budgets if they are to balance their books, continuing to meet the demands placed on them over the next number of years?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can confirm the factual point that Mr Rowley makes, that if the needs-based formula is applied, rather than the roll forward of the 14-15 budget settlement in revenue funding, Fife Council will have a budget that is £2.453 million lower than if the formula had been rolled forward. The second point Mr Rowley makes is in relation to the funding position of local government in Scotland, and I cannot agree with him in relation to the nature of the settlement that the Scottish Government has put forward. If local government's budget has been rising at a faster rate than the resources under the control of the Scottish Government, that says to me, in a tight financial environment, which we all know we're living in, given the public finance constraints that are being applied by the United Kingdom Government, local government has been treated very sympathetically compared to authorities in other parts of these islands. Indeed, I met the President of the Local Government Association the week before last, the Local Government Association of England, who was speaking in very complimentary terms about how supportive financially the Scottish Government had been to local government in Scotland compared to the swinging reductions in budget that had been experienced south of the border. So, of course, there are public spending constraints. Mr Rowley wrestled with these during his term in office as leader of Fife Council. I've been wrestling with them, but the decisions of this administration have been to give much greater preference to local government than has been given to local government in other parts of the country, and I can see that reflected in some of the approaches and decisions that have been taken in the design of public services. And the last point I would make in answering Mr Rowley is this. There is a need for us to reconfigure and to restructure services delivered by local authorities in partnership with other public bodies, principally the health service. That's why integration of health and social care is so important, a priority for this government, and I look forward to taking forward constructive discussions to ensure that we use the resources at our disposal in a most effective way to deliver on the best outcomes for the people of our country.
Finally, Billy Benny.
Now that it seems that you might be welcome back in Aberdeen, will he take this opportunity to review his previous commitment to meet the 85% floor of the average funding for local authorities in Scotland, which is worth £20 million to Aberdeen?
Cabinet Secretary.
What I'd say to Mr Rennie is the Government has fulfilled its commitment to provide the 85% floor to local authorities in Scotland. That was put into the settlement, and I would just remind Mr Rennie that that was a provision put into place by this SNP administration and never put in place by any administration of which he was a supporter.
Thank you. That ends topical question time. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 9209 in the name